Good afternoon and a warm welcome to you on behalf of AHDB. This is the second of our Milling Wheat Week webinars. Welcome back if you were with us yesterday for the Technical Insights webinar. If you missed it but wish you hadn't, you will be able to catch it on the recording. Well, today it's supply chain and policy, but before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. You are all muted. We're due to finish at approximately 2 o'clock. It might run slightly over. If you wish to ask questions, I hope you will, please can you use the question tab which you'll find on the right hand side of your screen. It should look grey in a strip of tabs. Use that please throughout the webinar and those questions will be dealt with. Cpd points are available for this webinar, that's Basis and Naroso. You'll need to download the form please from the handout tab, which again is in that control panel, and sign it and return to events@ahdb.org.uk, or you can complete the form which will be sent to you after the event. That's it for those bits. So now it's time to introduce you to our chairman for this session. Very pleased to introduce General of UK Flour Mill, Alex Waugh. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Judith, if you could stop sharing your screen for a minute, that'd be great. Here we are, here's the program. So welcome, as Judith says, I'm Alex Waugh, I'm the Director of UK Flour Millers, formerly known as nabim. We've got a good program ahead of us, starting off with Phil Bicknell, who is Director of Market Intelligence at AHDB. Lots and lots of experience in the food and farming sector, stemming from bidwells to USDA, to the BPC and NFU, and now AHDB. A great man to take us through and give us some insight on where next for milling wheat. And after that, two very good speakers to discuss the situation in the future. George Mason, who's been a senior executive at Heygates for 25 years or so. Heygates is a business with interests in farming, animal feed, but also flour milling and baking. And Ian Backhouse, farmer from Yorkshire. Again, lots of experience in this kind of area, having been on the board of AHDB and formerly chairman of the NFU, AHDB cereals, that is, and formerly chairman of the NFU cereals committee. So really good group. So just a little bit of intro from me. UK flour milling, it's a big sector, using 5 million tons of wheat or so for human consumption. Then there's more going into the starch sector as well. And one that is investing heavily in the future. There's been a big investment program in flour mills in different businesses, and I would say that the UK, Great Britain, probably has one of the most modern sets of flour mills of any European country, possibly anywhere in the world, and that is a sign of confidence, and it's built on having good relationships with suppliers, farmers here in Great Britain, and also very good links with the businesses further down the chain who are using flour. So you could say that the businesses in our sector very much see a bright future and are investing for that. But that's enough of that. Phil, perhaps I can hand over to you now, to take us through your presentation on where next for UK milling wheat, and how things are going to change over the next few years as we come to terms with a new relationship with the European Union, new farm policy, and probably a new trading environment. So over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Alex, and afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so look, I'm going to look at where next for milling wheat, and as Alex says, there's a range of different themes and topics that I'll touch on, and hopefully that also gives a springboard for the panel to pick up on some of those views as well. But first of all, let's take a quick look at where it is we're starting from. And so, look, apologies, I'm the Market Intelligence Director at AHDB, so you've got to expect a few numbers in the slides. So, what you're seeing there on the screen is some figures from our balance sheet work, looking specifically at the milling sector. And for the season to date, you know, stand out to me, homegrown wheat milled is currently down 18.6%. And look, that's not surprising given our low production figure in 2020. And it also means that significant imports have been required to fill that deficit. It's also not surprising that the December figure for imported wheat milled is therefore up 115% on the same time last year at just over 150,000 tonnes. The reality is that we've milled nearly as much imported wheat in the first half of this season as we did in the whole 1920 year. So 743,000 tonnes versus just shy of 750,000. But it's not just the supply side that we're dealing with. COVID is impacting demand. And the bottom line, I think, is that COVID has changed what we eat and where we eat. And that's been universal across the board for the food sector, and that's had knock-on impacts in some farming sectors as well. But broadly speaking, it's been bad news for food service, and that impact is still being felt. Missing out on Christmas will have been critical to the food service sector, and that phased return to a new normal that we heard laid out earlier this week further limits the recovery of the food service sector. But where the food service has been on the negative side, we've seen some positives on the retail side, and there has been that upside when we look at aspects like the numbers of people scratch cooking. There's millions more scratch cooking occasions that have taken place in the last year. There's been a boom in baking more widely. Some 16% more baking occasions have taken place over the last year. And not just that, but it's also expanded what people are baking. And research that we've done has found out that 35% of consumers are trying out a new recipe every month. That all adds up in terms of that demand proposition. And ultimately, that's boosted flour consumption. More shoppers have bought flour more often. Growth has dipped more recently. Actually, if we look at the monthly sales figures, December marks the first month where actually we've shown a dip year on year. But if we look back over the 12 months before that, household flour usage is up by over 16%. And that means an additional, what, 48,000 tonnes of product. I suppose when I look at COVID more widely and think about it, particularly in terms of the arable sector, again, that impact has been broad. So I think about pubs being closed or operating under restrictions for much of the last year. We've seen barley usage down. That's fallen by, we reckon, just shy of 140,000 tonnes, some 16%. And barley usage has been consistently down when we're comparing figures year on year. COVID is one big talking point of the last 12 months. It's our exit from the EU that I think has been the other and has certainly dominated the headlines. And I think the problems with trading delays that we've seen reported widely, certainly through the first few weeks of January and even this month as well. A lot of those hiccups and delays relate to roll-on, roll-off shipments of products. They relate to container loads of products rather than boatloads of grains per se. And I think as an industry, we're used to dealing with shipments with third countries when it comes to commodities. But we can't discount the increase in paperwork and admin. Some 55% of our trade in agri-commodities is with the EU. So effectively, rule of thumb, double the admin burden if we're thinking about trade friction. Now, for me, it seems something of an irony that we talk about increasing exports, adding value to products. But when I've looked at the products that have been impacted by EU exit-related delays, it tends to be those added value products where we're encountering the complexities. And I think particularly pertinent for the milling sector are the rules of origin that we have and the 15% threshold about where the product comes from. Flour exports, where a proportion of the grist can be imported, is a really pivotal one here. Now, I suppose the positive that we had from our exit from the EU is that we avoided tariffs. We had a deal that facilitated trade. But I'm conscious that the lead time for many of our food businesses was limited, to say the least. And we previously, before that, I think we saw lots of food businesses planning for contingencies. So I think across the board, and if I look at a range of agricultural products, you tended to see November and December more shipments as businesses stockpiled, built their own stocks, and ultimately kind of imported more volumes. And ultimately the milling sector was no different, and I guess we know that some mills have cover into March. Now, I think it's fair to say that some of the circumstances meant that there's been increased access to the UK market. It's reasonable to assume that there's a rebound in wheat this year. We know that the wheat area is up 28% year on year in terms of plantings. Not a great surprise given the change in the weather picture. And whilst an attractive milling premium this year, I think should also drive a reasonable size milling crop. So that's just kind of a little bit of where we are. What about the challenges heading our way? And I suppose we might have got a trade deal with Europe that avoids tariffs, but for me, there's still some pretty fundamental and significant challenges in the pipeline from a farming sector, from a milling sector. One area I think of is in terms of our relative competitiveness. Now, compared to other producers of milling wheat, we're a relatively high cost producer, certainly versus Canada, Russia, and the Ukraine that you can see on the chart there. But bear in mind that, and actually we're on a par, I suppose, in terms of cost of production with Germany. But I think one thing to bear in mind is that they will have a basic payment on a per hectare basis from the Common Agricultural Policy, whereas for us in England, we're facing that loss of direct payments. And actually that loss of the BPS, I think, is a potentially critical one. Now, I'm conscious that when we look at farm business income, which is used as a proxy for profitability of farm businesses, when we look at that from agricultural activity, according to DEFRA's latest farm business survey, that figure is around about £10,000. When we look at actually revenues into farm businesses from the BPS for the average cereal farm, that is just under £40,000. So that means that the largest component of farm profitability on the average cereals farm, certainly when looking back to the last year, and it's also characteristic for the 2 or 3 years before that, the largest component has been the direct payment. And we all need to be conscious that that's going to be phased out. And what you can see on the screen there is that average payment for the average cereals farm, the decline that that's going to face when we're projecting that forward to 2027, 2028. Now, government has, of course, outlined the plans through to 2024, and we've then made assumptions that that trend continues beyond that point. And the business impact calculator is on the AHDB website, so you can add your own numbers in that in terms of your BPS and get your own chart for what the future payments will be for your farming business. Now, I'm conscious that we're all looking at environmental schemes and thinking through in particular what environmental land management will mean. We know that there's pilots, we know there's more detail coming, but I think what farmers are asking for is the specifics to help planning. What's going to be rewarded at what rate? What does it mean for my bottom line? Those are the questions that I think farmers are asking, but we're as yet waiting for those answers. And although I'm conscious that there's commitments from government to keep the overall funding pot the same, at least until 2024, I think it's important to remember that environmental schemes are not going to be a like-for-like replacement for BPS. And my view is that the focus on environmental land management in particular will see some land taken out of production. And as much as we might like to think that that relates to maybe poor quality pasture land, I think we'd also be naive to think that it won't apply to some marginal arable land as well. Elm is perhaps the carrot aspect to future environmental policy, but I'm conscious that we also can't ignore the potential stick. And by that I mean some of the regulation aspects. And I'm conscious that milling wheat in particular means we need nitrogen to hit the protein spec. And just a couple of thoughts on the challenges I think that kind of potentially come from a greater focus on regulation. And one of these is triggered by that recent consultation on urea. And I think it just focuses the mind in terms of ammonia emissions. As an economist, look, numbers again are what matters to me, and on a pound per hectare basis, the active fertilizer of non-stabilized urea is distinctly cheaper than that of ammonium nitrate. 2019-20 crop year, for instance, AN had a value of £124 a hectare. Urea was some £20 less than that. So we need to be aware that potential policy changes are also going to have cost implications. And I suppose thinking about things more broadly, I'm also conscious that farm businesses need access to the plant protection products as part of our toolkit. And I think the policy that is heading our way is not just about the environment. I'm conscious of the government consultation on gene editing that was released back in January. As an industry, we know we've got challenges with diseases and weeds, but increasingly we're facing that challenge in terms of access to chemistry. It's likely we're going to have less and less of it. So from my perspective, it will be really interesting to see the direction of travel in terms of that consultation, the response that we get, and just thinking through, actually, is gene editing part of the solution? For my money, it is. Plant breeding is what gives us the answers. Gene editing is going to help us achieve that. One area that I do wonder from a policy perspective as well is DEFRA's powers when it comes to market transparency. Now, George Eustace mentioned it yesterday at the NFU conference. It's a sentiment I agree with, but the practicalities of making it happen need focus. And I think, like many other sectors, we've seen consolidation in the milling wheat supply chain. That transparency gets harder when a sector is in fewer and fewer hands, and that's the reality we operate in. I wanted also to kind of approach the environment from the demand side and think through a little bit in terms of what consumers want. I'm conscious that the policy drivers are skewed to the supply side. Now, one of the key characteristics when we've looked at some of the top performing farm businesses is that they understand the market and what's happening. And I guess it's almost an exaggeration to say the broader change that is coming for us in farming is shifting away from producing something first and then working out how to sell it, towards changing to a world where we know what the market wants and rewards, and then we can work out whether we can produce it profitably. Right now, I think we're lacking when it comes to knowing what's of value to customers and what rewards are on offer. Plus, sometimes we fall into the trap of expecting a higher price. Sometimes those rewards might materialize in a different way. That might be preferential access or reduced cost. And that's arguably the case on assurance right now, where some of us in the farming industry are scratching our heads and asking if what we measure, track and evaluate are really the areas where the consumer actually requires assurance and questions where the value is. And that's maybe a point that the panel will want to pick up on, but it does concern me that we miss the potential to focus on what shoppers want and value when it comes to the environment. And therefore, we don't fully capitalise on the environmental potential. Now, we've looked at shopper trust in quite a bit of depth, and there's more research on the way. And we hear a lot from the activists, or we hear a lot from the academics. We all see some fairly polarised debates on social media, but what's the overarching view of shoppers? What are the thoughts of the silent majority? Well, look, first up, I think it's important to stress that attitudes to agriculture are broadly supportive. And actually, for farming as a whole, they've strengthened over the last year. And there's some 66% that are somewhat or very supportive. Now, for cereals, that support is higher than average. Not a huge amount, but it's 68% supportive. That's better than average. And the important thing for me is that only 3% have negative impressions of the sector. Now, if you just got your views from looking on social media, you might not get that impression. Secondly, I think it's worth emphasising and remembering that farmers are the most trusted part of the supply chain, more than processors, supermarkets, food service or government. There's been some positive shifts year on year for all of those, but again, I look back at contrasting the viewpoints of where we think we might be as farmers, particularly in terms of our reaction in social media, where it feels like we're in the firing line. Just sometimes we need to remind ourselves that we're looking at the bigger picture. And I think that's particularly the case when it comes to the environment. Farming is down the list when it comes to consumers' issues of concern. That's the reality. We're not necessarily top of mind when you go out and ask shoppers immediately what their environmental concerns are. But there are some issues that are relevant to us and are top of mind. And whether we're talking about the kind of habitat and rainforest destruction, plastic food packaging, arguably these are really global issues that don't really apply to us from a UK perspective. But I do think there are some issues that are relevant. I suppose the key consumer, the key aspect on all this is what the consumer concerns are, but rather what we do about them. What is it that farmers can do that underline our environmental credentials? And I think there's things that are flagged up. So again, out of research, aspects around planting trees and hedgerows tends to be top of the list. There's a few other things that can play well for the arable sector, I think, if we're looking ahead to meeting shoppers' increasing environmental concerns in future. One standout point for me, though, is that whatever we achieve from an environmental perspective, there's always going to be more to go at. Take that commitment around net zero, which is what the industry is clearly aligned to in terms of ambition, and activity is also moving in that area. But we shouldn't expect to gain plaudits and recognition if we haven't also addressed the packaging challenge. So this comes to me, says to me, this is where a supply chain needs to work together. So look, just to close before I hand over to Alex and the panel discussion. Look, my final remarks: 2020 feels like an exceptional year, both when we approach it from a production viewpoint and the demand side. I suppose the real question for me is whether, with the benefit of time, we come to look back on 2020 as either a blip in the data series or a genuine turning point. Now, I think the answer to that is going to be determined by how we respond, not just as a farming sector, but as a supply chain. It's going to be determined by our resilience to loss of direct payments. It's going to be determined by the permanent changes that result from COVID, and ultimately how we preempt the increasing expectations that shoppers have of our industry. So my money, when we look back, is that this will feel like a turning point. So Alex, that's a canter 3 for you. Hopefully it's given you a few talking points for George and Ian, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Phil. That's terrific. You know, a real range of stuff in there. So now we're going to move on to a discussion involving George Mason and Ian Backhouse. George and Ian, if you could show yourselves on the screen now, that'd be great. You know, let me start things off taking one of the points raised by Phil just now, and that's about consumer engagement and some of the stuff that we've been seeing on farming forums about Red Tractor and farm assurance. And George, can I start off with you? Now, how do millers see Red Tractor, and in particular, how do imports fit in? You know, there's some concern that perhaps millers are a bit not so careful about imports as they are about UK source supplies. Could you address that?
Yeah, okay. So the milling industry is totally supportive of Red Tractor. If you go back in time, 20 years ago, we were suffering some pretty significant food safety issues in the UK, BSE, foot and mouth, salmonella, and the last thing that anyone in the industry wanted was a food scare in the cereal sector. So out of it was born the Red Tractor. What has it given us? It's given us confidence and security in the raw materials that we are buying for feed and food. So today it is commonplace that our flour customers are requesting Red Tractor. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge for them to use it on their finished products they're selling in their shops. But for all intents and purposes, it is a very useful, powerful tool to have. The frustration this year, of course, is, as we've heard from Phil, we've come off the back of a pretty unique harvest. I certainly can't remember 40 years ago when we had a harvest this size, but a crop of less than 10 million tons creates a deficit for the country. Now, we've all got a responsibility as farmers, as primary processors, to feed the nation. So if there is a deficit, we have to find it from somewhere. Now, the imports in a normal year, if you take things like North American wheat, they're bought in because they have got qualities and functionality that we can't source from wheat grown in the UK. When you have a small harvest like we've just had and the deficit, we have to make up lost tons. And for the most part, those tons have come from EU and in particular Germany. So a lot of the criticism has been of late on social media and even the NFU yesterday that the standards of those imports aren't the same in respect of assurance as Red Tractor. Well, it's true to say that, let's take Germany because that's the country we're talking about. Germany does not have a Red Tractor scheme. But what it does have is a government-controlled scheme of on-farm auditing, unannounced audits, where government officials will go onto farm and look at all records and all activities of farms. If it's a cross-compliance scheme, so if there are any failings and any non-compliance, those farmers will be fined. One of the other things they look at is the inputs and the origin of the inputs. So as an example, if a German farmer were to import chemicals or fertilizer from outside the EU, then the German government has a system of fining that ranges from 50,000 to 500,000 euros. So the system is pretty robust. I think the other thing you've got to consider as well in places like Germany is that they produce an awful lot of wheat, and a very significant part of that is exported. So in Germany, about 1/3 of their wheat is exported. In France, it's nearly 50%. And so they must have systems in place to give their customers, their importers, confidence in the product that they're trading. So in a nutshell, we are very, very supportive of Red Tractor. It is a shame that we've had the situation from last harvest that we have. But I think if we go this 21 harvest, if we go back to 14.5 million tons, then you will find that the imports will plummet, subject to harvest quality, obviously.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ian. What do you make of that? Do you how as a farmer, does that convince you?
Well, Red Tractor has been a useful means over the years of ensuring that there's a base level of compliance on farm, and that we were always of the belief, and I believe we still are of the belief, that it does give us something that other countries don't have. I mean, George mentioned the German system there. That's part of their cross-compliance scheme. It's not done on every farm. It's just a random it's a sample of BPS, what would be the equivalent of BPS applicants in this country. And throughout Europe, when we were putting Red Tractor through for the renewable fuels obligation, they couldn't believe that we inspected every farm every year. I'm not saying that doesn't smack of overkill, but at the same time, it does give that level of reassurance. It might not deliver a premium to the market, but it should deliver us market access, which is something that George talks about. They would prefer to buy UK milling wheat if the spec was available. I think we have to be clear, there's difference between tangible quality benefits, which is the physical quality of the grain, and the intangibles, which is the assurance schemes that underwrites it. And if consumers are going to start asking more of those schemes in terms of sustainability, in terms of traceability, in terms of provenance, then those schemes need to apply to wheat that's coming from abroad as well. going forward. It's only true, you know, if the consumer is putting pressure through the supermarket, through the baker, on the miller to say, you know, your wheat must meet this sort of standard in terms of carbon footprinting or environmental footprint, then it's intrinsic on that supply chain to make sure that those standards are adhered to across all the products they're buying. At the same time, I think we have to be wary of what the consumer's requesting, and we have to ensure that they're not requesting things that the supply chain can't deliver. We need to ensure the consumer doesn't go into fantasy land.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's a fair challenge, George, isn't it? That, you know, if that kind of sort of quality of production is a factor, then, you know, millers or other importers should be looking for that from their international suppliers as well. If they're going to be using international suppliers, they need or should be having that same sort of backup, shouldn't they? That's not an unreasonable thing to ask.
No, I totally agree, and I can understand every producer's frustration in the country where they are saddled with the level of bureaucracy that maybe some of these schemes bring. But the main selling point of Red Tractor is that it is an audited scheme. That is something that our customers are very, very keen and supportive of. Now, I think the medium term, we've heard from Phil on how the payments are going to be reduced in the coming years. That is putting the fear of God into us, because the area of wheat production is only likely to fall. This change in system is not going to increase production. And yes, it may well take the marginal areas out, but if we get to a situation where a 12 or 13 million ton wheat crop is commonplace, then with the matrix of demand that we've got at the moment, we will create a deficit every year. Now, what that'll probably mean is that, yes, we would have to import more, but if we are consistently importing from year to year to year, we can install these assurance programs into our international suppliers. The problem we have at the moment, we've gone from a 16 million plus ton crop down to a 9 million ton crop. We imported next to nothing last year, and we're importing an awful lot this year. It is not a consistent program.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite right, is it? I mean, there are imports every year, you know, from North America. Are there schemes in place for those kinds of, you know, regular imports already?
Well, there are. If you look at what comes from America, last year I think we did 30,000 tons, which is 2 boatloads. If you look at the Canadian, there are programs of shipments from Canada, and let's face it, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the majority of the wheat that we ate came from Canada. The volume that comes from Canada is probably the most consistent of all origins. And yes, there are programs out there. If you take one of the major bread brands, he will have a growing program for Canadian wheat. And that retains its identity all the way through to the mills in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just conscious of time. I know we can come back to this, and if people have got questions, do put them to the chat. Just moving on to sustainability, which you talked about, Ian, and Phil covered as well in his talk, his introduction, thinking about the future. Okay, we've got declining basic payment scheme and a replacement with ELMS to come and to map into. And how do you think, Ian, farmers are going to react? I mean, are we going to see a move out of arable farming into environmental farming, as it were, to collect those payments? Are we going to see what George fears, a big reduction in wheat area? What's the prospect?
I mean, a lot of that will depend on 2 things. One is what the the content of the scheme is and the payments that are made in the scheme, and second is what is the climate we're going to be operating in as we go forward. I mean, the reality is, and Phil showed us the slide, which is the decline in farm income. Farmers will look at their businesses and be serious about how much it will cost them to grow wheat, and if they're finding it marginal in terms of profitability and they can make that profit elsewhere, then they will do so. There's a lot still unknown about what the details are going to be on the government policy going forward, but certainly there is a danger that if it's structured wrong and the market is also working against farmers, that some of George's fears could be borne out. But I wouldn't want to be sort of overly pessimistic, because farmers are, if nothing, one, resilient, and two, adaptable and flexible. They're very good. They're known. They'll tighten their belts and they'll find ways to carry on doing the job they love doing. The question will be, if the supply chain makes too many demands that adds too much cost on at a time when it's getting harder to produce what they want to produce at the right quality, then that might drive them into looking at alternatives.
Yeah, okay. So George, I mean, are your customers more and more interested in the environmental credentials of grain?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think it was highlighted again in Phil's slide of where the focus is in sustainability, and it's probably not wheat growers in East Anglia, but a lot of our customers are seeing sustainability go up their ladder of importance, and I would think every week we are getting customers contacting us on where we see sustainability and what can be done. The big difficulty is we've got an awful lot of people asking, but we've not got an awful lot of people telling us what they actually want. The definition of sustainability is difficult, and I think whilst it's very high on the government's agenda, our customers aren't quite so clear on exactly what the future holds. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring everyone together and try and form a common approach towards sustainability. And that's going to take some time, because a lot of companies aren't quite certain what they want. But the last thing we want is a whole lot of a plethora of different schemes where it all becomes very confusing and very burdensome. We want something that's simple, achievable, workable, measurable, and doesn't cost a fortune. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, we all appreciate we've got to do and play our part in this. It's work in progress, I think.
So, but George, if you know, we talked about the sort of pressure on nitrogen. If farmers use less nitrogen, produce lower protein wheat, would you buy it, or would you switch to imports?
Well, we would always support English wheat at the end of the day. If through the progression of new varieties that yield more come along, which is more than likely, then there becomes more pressure on nitrogen application and protein levels and achieved levels. I would suggest that most flour mills in the country will offer some flexibility on protein levels. Don't forget, it's not always the quantity of protein, it's the quality of protein, it's the functionality that we're looking for. So over the years, millers have been able to develop to what has been grown in the UK. If you go back to the Chorleywood bread making process. So we've got experience in being able to adapt. But at the end of the day, we must make sure that the finished product that we make meets the right standard. Now, if there is a loss of protein, it could be replaced with gluten, or it could be replaced with imported wheat. And that's really where your North American wheats come into play. But if you look
Okay.
at nitrogen applications, you're also looking at the chemical aspects as well. How many more chemicals are going to be taken out of the armory that the farmer has got? Glyphosate, taking that out is hugely important. So it's going to be an uncertain time.
Yeah, all right.
Alex, I think that just highlights the problems we're going to be faced with going forward, because we've got a part of the supply chain there that's got to protect its business. Its business is milling flour to a certain specification to meet the baker's requirements of the UK. That's the tangible quality aspect of what we're producing. We've then got the intangibles, the environmental factors, the sustainability, a lot of which is sort of a bit of a woolly area that nobody really understands yet, nobody really knows. And this is why I was saying we've got to be careful about pushing back sometimes on the consumer, of making them wary of not asking for things that are undeliverable, because the danger there is all we do is export the problem. So we create a situation where we can't get the protein from the UK wheat, therefore we import the wheat, or we import gluten from elsewhere that is produced to using exactly the methods or exactly with the carbon footprint we've just said we don't want produced in this country. So it's something that with two things here. With one, we've got to make sure that we don't get asked to do things we can't deliver on. The second is, on an international stage, we've got to ensure that politicians, in their wisdom to go down this route of making UK wonderful and green, don't just export all the problems elsewhere.
Okay, that's a fair point. I just want to move on. We can come back to again. There's a couple of other questions in the chat, but I just want to move on to another of Phil's point about sort of transparency, connectivity of supply chains and data. We're hearing discussions about possible sort of rethinking of the passport scheme to make it digitized. Can I start with you, Ian, and then I come to you, George? I mean, Ian, is that a runner? Do you see some opportunities there? What could we do?
I've never hidden the fact that I've been in favour of the green passport. It is a simple way of communicating direct from farm to the processor who receives your wheat. No matter how many routes or transactions happen in terms of the contract by merchants buying and selling the wheat, the reality is the passport goes with the wheat straight from farm to the first processor. So therefore, it is a more reliable way of that processor getting hold of quality information about the wheat and potentially any other information he needs to deliver on sustainability or carbon footprint in the future. The other beauty of it, because it opens that line of communication up, it's a way of the farmer getting what he's wanted for a long time, which is a more quicker feedback on the quality of the load that's delivered at the mill. So more or less, as the mill knows the quality to tip the load, the farmer can find out as well, so that he can make plans for any other wheat he's got destined for that same destination. And I've made no bones. I think to try and digitize that process would make a lot of sense, because otherwise there is a danger that if you want more and more information, the passport, instead of becoming a single A4 piece of paper, ends up being a book of several pages.
Yeah. So George, what's your take on that? Do you agree with Ian, or are you?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. It's a fabulous opportunity that we've got to make some efficiencies within this chain. It'll mean that the farmer has got less to do. He hasn't got to marry up stickers on pieces of paper. It will bring efficiencies throughout every participant, whether it's the farmer, the haulier, the merchant, the receiver. We still have trip ups every day on grain passports, one way or another. You know, stickers gone missing, or it's the wrong sticker, or it's been filled in incorrectly. So all of that should disappear. So it is a great opportunity that shouldn't be missed.
Okay, and do you is this another way, do you think, that the obligation, as it were, on millers to buy wheat from the local market will be increased? You know, because does it make the supply chain even more sort of tightly gripped together compared with other origins?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some opportunities going forward over this period where we might see production dip, and I think Ian is right in his comments that farmers like growing wheat, so maybe the dip in production may not be as great as we thought, but things like sustainability, the support that consumers want to give UK Agriculture PLC, they are all there. And I wouldn't be surprised that if the sustainability piece does take off, that supply chains will become more formal than they are at the moment. So it's certainly not going to not help in that regard. And I think also, just coming back to the return of delivery information, certainly millers, and I can only talk for millers, have got nothing to hide with regard to quality of the deliveries. We're more than supportive of supplying the delivery data in a lifetime situation, and that's very important. Very important for everyone involved in the chain.
Okay, so positive response from millers, but obviously there's a little way to go because we haven't got a scheme up and running yet, and well, we'll just have to see how that goes. Right. Now I'm just going to we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm just going to go through some of the questions that are here in the chat and put them to you. So we've got one here on nitrogen, which I think we've addressed. So there's a question about, okay, so how confident are we in relation to the production of wheat from the UK? And the answer is, well, we don't really know. There's a lot in play, I guess. I think you've covered that already. Then, okay, so a question about premium for assured wheat. What's going on? You know, but should there be a premium for assured wheat, or is it just about market access, George? What's your take? And I'm going to come to you on that, Ian.
Well,
I suppose
you go, George. You go.
So with the majority of the wheat grown in the UK in the Red Tractor scheme, the bulk of the wheat is already getting the premium. It is access to the market. The marketplace requires Red Tractor assurance, and so the price achievable today is inclusive of the premium. Where there's a price differential is the farmer that chooses not to be Red Tractor. Where does he sell his grain, and what price will he achieve? So it comes to the same thing, but maybe is window dressing. There is a two-tier price system of in and out of assurance. The farmer who is in Red Tractor today is receiving that premium because he has got access to the consumer that wants the product being assured.
All right, fine. Ian, what do you think?
I think it's a difficult one, is this, because as George said, the market access it grants is already perceives to give us a premium already. And I know that whenever I've spoken to exporters abroad, they've never been able to understand why we've not made more of our assurance schemes to try and gain market access in overseas markets. There are other complications behind that, such as exportable surplus, quality of what we produce, etc., etc. But some significant exporters commented to me a few years ago that it won't give you a premium in the world market. The world market price is the world market price. But there are markets where it will open doors for you. It will give you access where you haven't got access without it. I think the question there would be to come back, not to the millers, but would come back to our trade partners, merchants and exporters, to say, you know, are you taking the easy route? Are you just being cash sellers, or are you trying to help UK farmers by looking for opportunities abroad? Because, you know, there are instances where in some years we may be able to produce, for instance, the quality Group 2 wheat that could be sold abroad, and we could be substituting in feed mills with cheaper ingredients and selling our wheat abroad. But the traders always tell us, you know, it's a price differential thing, and there's no point even trying. Is that really true? And is that the crux of the problem? Not so much that we are have assurance, but that it's not been capitalized enough, or it's not been utilized enough in trying to create new markets.
Okay, so there's a string to our bow that we're not using effectively when it comes to selling the properties of the scheme, which I think is a fair point. Assuming that we're selling grain, but often, you know, the value in exports is those value-added products. So it's flour to an extent, but then, you know, biscuits or cakes or those other longer shelf life products which possibly have an international market appeal. And the challenge then is to those businesses, you know, do they see a value in that assurance in selling those products overseas, or is it just about the intrinsic product and how the consumer reacts to it? I think that's an interesting question, which I don't think we can answer just now. So I've got another question, which is kind of linked. You know, it's a financial question to do with digital passports, about costs and where the costs of that should fall. I think there's a concern amongst farmers that the costs will fall to them. George, what do you think about that?
Well, as the program develops, then funding is obviously going to come to the fore. AHDB have kindly said that they would fund the initial setup costs and the rollout costs. It's going to be interesting to see what the actual cost of running the scheme is. What it doesn't want to become is a scheme of collecting data, which is then sold to fund the scheme. I think that's quite crucial, that the data security is a significant part of this. There is an argument that everyone in the industry, everyone in the chain is going to benefit. So it is for all of us to help the funding of it. That would be my initial thought.
Yeah, fine. Ian, what's your take as a farmer?
I don't think the cost should be borne solely by the farmer.
Yeah.
If the supply chain is to benefit as a whole, and looking forward, if there are further demands on information that come from the supply chain, then it's only fair that they share the burden of the cost of supplying that information. Whether or not how you ring fence that sort of cost is very difficult to say, but certainly it's an area that we need to look at quite closely. I know AHDB have kindly said they'll run the setup costs, and before, when we looked at it, I think the setup cost, once it was up and running, it then sort of the running costs tailed down to a more reasonable level. But it's a supply chain project, so it should be a supply chain cost.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, is there any reason why the cost, the long running cost, should be any higher than a paper system? I mean, I just wonder. You know, you've got to produce bits of paper, get them out. You know, that's all intrinsic in the chain now. Phil, you're looking. Are you looking to intervene here?
The interesting bit for me, Alex, is that we probably, the debate starts to quite quickly get about costs and what the cost is, and for any kind of data related aspect, for me, some of the debate around what the value is as well.
Yeah.
So if I look at what we're doing around livestock information, as much as there's the statutory requirement of it, where we're partnering with DEFRA effectively to deliver that, the really interesting, the really exciting bits are where we can add value through farmers and the supply chain having better information. So I suppose the thing for me is at this early stage is making sure we have the debate about what the costs are, but also what the benefits might be and where they accrue.
I think that's actually spot on. You know, the thing about costs is it tends to be, you know, everybody focuses on the negative rather than the opportunities that come with anything new. So you know, there's a little bit of that around the red tractor discussion, and certainly now in relation to a digital passport. And it's interesting. So I referred earlier on to developments in flour milling, and it's notable that at least one of the new mills is being developed with blockchain in mind to integrate data into the whole system, and it seems pretty obvious, doesn't it, when you look to the future, that data input, data management, connecting chains through data is going to be the future. So it kind of almost feels inevitable. That's what we've got. That's the way things are going to go. The question is whether we have a collective control of this, or whether we end up with individual data management systems run by different proprietary businesses. And I don't know, George, whether you or Ian actually, whether you've got a take on that, whether you think it should be just left to the market, or whether this opportunity of a sort of universal scheme is the way we should be going.
A comment I would have on that with regard to sort of a better understanding on the UK crop, its quality of a whole and its availability, is that I think that we have a choice. Either we leave it to individual businesses, in which case none of us have an understanding beyond our own businesses. We allow it to go to the other extreme, which is government collect all the data, as is in the case in America, where the USDA provide the background information for the marketplace, or we as an industry take hold of it and do something ourselves that is collective and to the benefit of us all. The reality is we're outside the EU now. The government has no further obligation to collect the information that it was required to do for the management of the market by the EU. So the question is, what's going to come in that place? You know, if government are looking to cut costs, have they an interest to develop that information so we have better market understanding, or is it something we as an industry need to do?
Okay. Anything you want to say, George, on top of that?
I would agree with Ian. I would certainly go for a non-government independent body with cross-industry stakeholder participation. Yeah.
So I've got one final question, completely different subject, and that is about imports. And a question: why do we have to import? Could we replace those imports? Is there an opportunity for UK growers, especially with advances in genetic understanding, to produce the kinds of wheat that we import here in Britain and do away with that requirement?
I'll start off with gene editing, throw that in. There are various schemes that some have been more successful than others. We're presently growing a German variety in the UK. It fits on farm very well. It's got good functionality, good protein levels, and has been one of the success stories. Other varieties have come across and not been quite so good. A few years ago, we had red wheat grown quite widely in the UK. It lasted a few years. It didn't really bring the participants exactly what they hoped it might. So I think we have to, there are opportunities, but as we see the single farm payment erode, what we've got to try and make sure is we're going to get more from fewer acres.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe needs to be more specifically grown for specific markets.
Yeah, Ian, do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if we've got two limitations, one is what we can grow, and two, what will allow us to grow. If the breeders can deliver on providing us with the material that we can grow in our relative maritime climate and to produce suitable quality wheat, and the farmers can grow it profitably, they will do so. You know, there's no doubt about it. We've done in the past. We're an adaptable and flexible bunch, but we have to have the material to work with and the climate that will allow us to use that material to produce what the market wants.
Yeah, and the market has to pay for it. It has to be a profitable crop. I mean, the whole business of being a sustainable farmer is you have to be a profitable one as well. Otherwise, you're not going to be in business for long. Same as, you know, millers need sustainable, profitable suppliers, and as the growers need sustainable, profitable customers, and that way we'll all stay in business for longer. Look, we're out of time now. There's lots more questions. Sorry if you asked one of them and I haven't got to it. Thanks very much to all the panel, George, Ian, Phil, for participating. It's been a stimulating discussion. I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and have a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Just down to me then to do the last few bits. On behalf of AHDB, I would like to thank all of our speakers, Phil and George and Ian, and of course our chair for today, Alex. Thank you very much. Behind the scenes beavering away on the technical side, thank you Amanda and Claire for keeping all that bit running very smoothly. To everyone else, can you please complete the feedback survey? It will appear on your screen after the webinar ends, and a recording of the webinar will be sent to you within 24 hours, and the slides will be made available online. Again, can I just repeat, if you wish to collect basis and ROSO points for the webinar, please can you download the forms that you'll find in the handout section and return them to the events email address, events@ahdb.org.uk. Tomorrow, it will be the final webinar in the Milling Wheat series. It features the Yen Wheat Quality Awards, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from the winners and to question them. To book, if you haven't already, go to the events page on the AHDB website. Also worth mentioning, on Friday, we're running a further webinar jointly with United Oilseeds, and you can find the booking link again for that on the events page. Finally then, thank you for joining us.